The words were already perfect. I had rehearsed them so many times they had stopped feeling like a speech and started feeling like breathing, effortless, inevitable, mine. Stay forever. That's all I'm asking. Just stay. I had been carrying the ring for 23 days. Not because I was afraid. I want to be clear about that. Fear had nothing to do with the way I kept reaching into my coat pocket during my morning commute just to feel the velvet box there. Small, solid, certain. I was carrying it because I was waiting. Because Marcus deserved the right moment. Because 5 years of building something real with someone deserved more than a Tuesday night over reheated pasta. 5 years. Shared apartment in the West Village, 3rd floor, the one with the radiator that clanked like it had opinions. Shared routines. His coffee, my tea, both of us reaching past each other in the kitchen without looking because we had memorized each other completely. Shared toothbrush holder. Shared silences that never felt empty. Shared everything really, except the secret I had been keeping in my coat pocket for 23 days. I had planned it for the weekend. A reservation at the restaurant where we went on our 3rd date, the one with the low lighting and the sommelier who always remembered us. I had already called ahead. Already told them. I came home early that Friday because my last meeting canceled. I remember the particular quality of the quiet when I opened the front door, that specific apartment stillness that tells you someone is home but not in the room you can see. I could hear the low murmur of Marcus's voice from the living room. He was on the phone. I could hear the ease in his tone, that relaxed register he only used with his closest friends, and I felt warmth move through me the way it always did when I caught him unguarded. I set my bag down by the door. I loosened my scarf. I was smiling. He's definitely going to propose soon, Marcus said. I can tell. I went still. It wasn't alarm at first. Just attention. Just a kind of careful listening. Don't worry. A short laugh. Affectionate, dismissive. I'll shut it down gently. Marriage isn't really for me. Especially not right now. The coat was still on my shoulders. The velvet box was still in my pocket. He's great, honestly. Pause. Softer now, almost tender. He's just safe. You know. I have replayed that moment so many times since then that it has started to feel less like a memory and more like a scar. Something I keep pressing on without meaning to, morbidly checking whether it still hurts. It does. Safe. It is a word people use for things they love but do not fear losing. For umbrellas kept by the door. For insurance policies. For backup plans. I stood in the hallway of the apartment we shared, the one with the radiator that clanked, the one where I had imagined spending the rest of my life, and I understood with a clarity that was almost violent that Marcus had never been afraid of losing me, because he had never believed I would leave. I did not interrupt him. I did not walk into that living room and let him see my face. I have thought about that choice many times, whether it was dignity or cowardice, and I still do not have a clean answer. What I know is that I could not speak. Could not arrange my features into anything that resembled composure. So I turned quietly and walked to the bedroom. I opened the nightstand drawer. I placed the ring inside. I stood there for a long time with my hands still resting on the closed drawer, listening to the sound of Marcus laughing at something his friend said, light and easy, unbothered, and I tried to locate the version of myself who had been smiling 40 seconds ago in the hallway. He was already gone. The dinner reservation was still on the calendar. The sommelier still knew our names. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. What do you do when you discover that the person you love considers your love a given, not a gift? Chapter 2, The Gentle Withdrawal. I want you to understand something before I explain what happened next. I'm not a man who punishes people. I was raised by a father who went cold and silent when he was hurt, who turned absence into a weapon and wielded it with surgical precision, and I swore when I was 17 years old that I would never become him. That I would choose directness over withdrawal. Honesty over performance. So what I did in the weeks after I put that ring in the drawer, I need you to understand it was not punishment. It was grief. There is a particular kind of grief that has no funeral. No moment where the world acknowledges what you have lost and gives you permission to mourn it. What I had lost was a future. A specific, fully imagined future that I had been quietly building in my mind for months. The restaurant, the question, his face when I asked, the life that would follow. I had lost all of that in a hallway while still wearing my coat, and there was no one I could tell. So I grieved quietly. The way you do when the loss is invisible. I still woke up early to make coffee. I still asked about his meetings. I still listened when he talked about his difficult clients and his complicated friendships, because Marcus's life was interesting and I had always found him worth listening to. But I stopped leaning in first. It was a small thing. Almost invisible. But I was, the kind of man who reached across distances, who closed gaps between us without being asked, who pressed my mouth to his temple when he was stressed before he even realized he needed it. I was always the one who leaned. I stopped. I stopped planning vacations. He mentioned Barcelona in passing one evening and I said sounds fun and changed the subject. 6 months ago I would have had flights pulled up before he finished the sentence. I stopped talking about when we're older. Stopped using that specific future tense that lovers use to build shared universes. When we have a bigger kitchen, when we finally get a dog, when we retire somewhere with a real garden. Those sentences were gone. I hadn't announced their departure. They just stopped arriving. And I stopped looking at him the way I had always looked at him. This one I could not fully control. It happened in pieces the way feeling happens. Not decided, just done. The look I'm describing is not something I can easily name. It was something in my eyes when I watched him across a room, some unguarded quality, some softness that I am told was obvious to anyone paying attention. Marcus had told me once, early in our relationship, slightly drunk and more honest than usual, that the way I looked at him sometimes made him feel like the only thing in a room. I stopped giving him that. The warmth stayed. I was not cruel. But it became measured, deliberate in a way it had never been before, distributed with the quiet precision of someone who has learned to ration something precious because they finally understand it is not infinite. He noticed the absence before he understood it. I watched him notice. It happened gradually, like watching weather change. First there was confusion. He'd pause mid-sentence sometimes and look at me like he was trying to identify a sound he almost recognized. Then there was an effort to compensate. More touch, more questions about my day, more lingering in rooms I was occupying. And then something I had never seen on Marcus before. Insecurity. Real, visible, settling into his shoulders insecurity. He had always moved through our relationship with a certain ease. Not carelessness exactly, but the ease of a man who trusts his footing. And I had been his floor for 5 years. Solid, reliable, he had never questioned the floor before. Now he was pressing his foot down and finding something different. Not absence. But not the same certainty either. I watched him recalibrate and I felt something complicated move through me, guilt and sadness and something else that I am not proud of but will name honestly. The faint, terrible relief of being seen. Of maturing enough that my retreat could be felt. I had never known before that phone call whether I would be missed. Now I was finding out. But was that enough? And what exactly was I waiting for him to do? Chapter 3, Suspicion. I need to tell you about the Tuesday Marcus accused me of cheating on him, because it was the night everything finally broke open. It had been 6 weeks since the hallway. 6 weeks of measured warmth and quiet withdrawal, of Marcus pressing his foot against the floor and finding it uncertain. I had watched him grow more anxious with each passing week, more attentive in the desperate way rather than the genuine way, more alert to my phone, my schedule, the angle of my body when I sat beside him. I recognized what was happening. When people who have always felt secure suddenly feel insecure, they do not always respond with grace. They respond with surveillance. He had started noticing things. Not because the things were suspicious, but because anxiety does not require actual evidence, it manufactures its own. I had been staying later at work. Not secretly. Not with excuses. I would text him plainly, late night, don't wait up, and then I would sit in my office after everyone else had left and do the kind of slow, methodical work that required silence. I was updating contracts, reviewing quarterly reports. The ordinary, unglamorous machinery of a career that had kept running despite the fact that my private life was quietly disassembling itself. I had also updated my passport. This was practical. Mine had been expired for 8 months and I had been putting it off with the particular procrastination of someone who had believed, on some unconscious level, that he did not need to go anywhere because everything he wanted was already in the same apartment. I booked the appointment. I sent the forms. It was administrative. It was nothing. To Marcus, standing in the kitchen one morning and watching me slide the new passport into my desk drawer, it was apparently something. I caught his expression before he rearranged it. He looked like a man reading a language he almost understood. I said nothing. He said nothing. But something shifted in the air between us that morning, something that had the tight, pressurized quality of a room where all the windows had been sealed. The messages from Delilah were the thing that finally detonated it. Delilah was my colleague, 10 years with the firm, brilliant, married, the kind of woman who communicated entirely in efficient sentences and dry humor. We had been collaborating on a project for 3 weeks, which meant frequent messages at odd hours because Delilah operated on her own schedule and did not apologize for it. Her messages were professional, terse, completely unremarkable. Marcus saw her name on my screen 3 nights in a row. The third night he said her name out loud while I was washing dishes. Just the name. Hanging in the air like a question he hadn't finished forming. I turned off the tap. What about her? Nothing. He was looking at the counter. Just, she messages you a lot. We're working on something. At 11 at night. She's in a different time zone half the week. He nodded. The way people nod when they're not actually agreeing with anything. I dried my hands, turned around, leaned against the sink and looked at him. And Marcus, who had always been composed, who had always been the one in our relationship with the easier relationship to his own emotions, fell apart in the specific way that people fall apart when they have been holding something too long. Are you cheating on me? The words landed between us and sat there. I felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite sadness. It was something older and stranger, the feeling of being looked at by someone who had known you for 5 years and had still managed to construct a version of you that was capable of this. I did not raise my voice. I crossed to the kitchen counter where my phone was sitting and I picked it up and unlocked it and held it out to him. Check. He stared at it. Go ahead, Marcus. Messages. Location history. Emails. Check whatever you need to check. He didn't take the phone for a long moment. And then he did. And he stood there in our kitchen, the one with the radiator we could hear from 2 rooms away, and he scrolled through my life with the focused expression of someone who is desperately hoping to find something and desperately hoping not to. He found nothing. Because there was nothing. He set the phone down on the counter with a careful quietness that was somehow worse than if he had thrown it. He looked like a man who had just lost an argument with himself. I'm sorry, he said. Oh, genuinely ashamed. I know. I don't know why I do. He looked up at me then. And here is the moment I want to slow down for you because it mattered more than it probably looked like it did from the outside. We were standing in our kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, the city doing its usual indifferent roar beyond the windows, and I was looking at the man I had loved for 5 years, still loved, I want to be precise about that, I had not stopped, and I was making a decision. I could let this be another silent shift, another quiet withdrawal, another thing we moved around without addressing. Or I could tell him the truth. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Not close. Not the chair beside him the way I would have once. The one opposite with the full width of the table between us. I want to build a life with someone, I said. Not maintain a comfortable arrangement. Build something. A real future with intention. He was very still. And I need that person to want the same thing. I looked at him steadily. I need them to choose it. Not just tolerate it because it arrived without being asked for. The silence in the room changed quality. It became the kind that precedes something irreversible. I came home early 6 weeks ago, I said. You were on the phone. I watched the color leave his face. And then, because he deserved the full weight of it, not cruelty, just truth, I told him everything. The hallway. The coat still on my shoulders. The specific word that had rearranged something fundamental inside me. The ring I had been carrying for 23 days that was now sitting in a nightstand drawer instead of in my coat pocket where it had been waiting for the right moment. I said it all quietly. Without theater. Without accusation in my voice, because accusation would have let him focus on my tone instead of my words and I needed him to hear my words. When I finished, Marcus looked like a man who had just understood the shape of a mistake so large he hadn't been able to see its edges until now. I leave for Europe in 3 weeks, I said. What? The firm has been asking me to take the Brussels position for 2 years. I said yes. The room went very, very quiet. And Marcus sat across from me with the table between us and said absolutely nothing, and I watched him understand, for the first time I think in 5 years, that I was not a permanent fixture. That steadiness is not the same as permanence. That a man who always stays can also, eventually, leave. And the question neither of us could answer yet was whether that was already too late to matter. Chapter 4. The Man Who Always Stayed. I have a theory about people who are loved steadily for a long time. I think it does something to them, something gradual and invisible, the way water reshapes stone without either the water or the stone fully registering the change. I think being loved without conditions, without withdrawal, without the threat of loss, can quietly teach a person that love is a landscape rather than a choice. That it simply exists, surrounding, ambient, inexhaustible, the way air exists. You do not think about air. You do not tend to it. You do not wake up in the morning and consciously decide to be grateful for it. You just breathe. I had been Marcus's air for 5 years. And I watched him, in the days after our kitchen conversation, learn what it felt like to find the room suddenly thin. He did not sleep. I know this because I am a light sleeper and I could hear him on the other side of the bed, the particular quality of stillness that is not rest but performance, a body lying motionless while a mind does something frantic and loud. I would lie there in the dark listening to him not sleep and I would feel the complicated thing I had been feeling for 6 weeks, that layered, difficult emotion that was grief and love and exhaustion wound so tightly around each other I had stopped trying to separate them. He started leaving for work later. Missing his usual train on purpose, I think, to extend the window of time in which I might change my mind about something, though I had not announced what that something was. I had told him I was leaving for Brussels. I had not told him what it would take for me to reconsider. Partly because I was not certain I knew. Partly because I did not think it was my job to hand him the answer. If Marcus was going to prove something, it needed to be to himself first. On the fourth night, I woke at 2 in the morning to an empty bed. I found him in the living room. No lights on. Just the ambient glow of the city through the windows we had never fully covered because we both liked the way New York looked at night. That orange-gray luminescence like the sky was always slightly on fire. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, which is not something Marcus did. Marcus was a furniture user. A cushion arranger. The floor was not in his vocabulary. I stood in the doorway. He didn't hear me at first. He was staring at the window with the expression of someone watching a film only they could see, and I recognized the particular quality of that stare. I had worn it myself for 23 days, every time I reached into my coat pocket. He was replaying something. Marcus. He turned. He did not scramble to compose himself the way he might have a month ago, performing fine because he had always had the luxury of actually being fine. He just looked at me. Undone in a way I had never seen him before, and I want to be honest, there was nothing satisfying about it. I had thought, in some dark corner of myself, that seeing Marcus genuinely shaken might feel like justice. Like the universe correcting an imbalance. It did not feel like that. It felt like watching someone I loved suffer, which is what it was. I've been sitting here trying to remember, he said, if I ever actually told you. I moved to the armchair across from him. Sat down. Told me what? That I knew. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, the way people do when they're trying to locate something inside themselves. I always knew what you were to me. How much? I just never said it out loud because it felt obvious. Like stating it would be redundant. It wasn't obvious to me. I know that now. The city hummed outside. A cab horn somewhere far below. The radiator, faithful and opinionated. I was scared, he said. I waited. Not of marriage. He said it carefully like he was reading the sentence in real time and checking it for accuracy. Not of commitment. I know that's what it sounded like. I know that's what I told Priya, what you heard me tell Priya, but it wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even most of the truth. Then what was the truth? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. And then, you love me so completely. You always have. From basically the beginning you looked at me like I was worth that. Like I deserved the specific way you loved me. He exhaled. Slow. Effortful. And I have spent 5 years waiting to do something that proved you wrong. The room felt very still. I'm not a good enough person, he said. That's what I believed. Not consciously. But underneath everything, underneath all of it, I thought if we made it permanent, if we made it official and witnessed and real, then eventually you would see it. The gap between who you thought I was and who I actually was. And you would leave anyway. Except then it would be worse. I sat with that for a moment. So you were going to leave first, I said. I was going to make sure it stayed something I could survive losing. I understood that logic. I understood it in the way you understand a language you were raised adjacent to but never quite fluent in. My father had operated the same way, keeping everything he loved at a specific, managed distance so that its absence, when it came, would be something he had already practiced. It is a terrible strategy. It guarantees the loss it is designed to prevent. Safe, I said. He flinched. You called me safe. I know. I've been thinking about that word for 6 weeks. I know. He stopped. Started again. I didn't mean what you heard. I swear to you that is not what I meant. I meant that you were the only thing in my life that felt certain. That felt like ground. You were safe the way something you build your whole life around is safe. Safe like home. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Recovered. But I heard it back through your ears when you told me what you'd heard, and I understand. I understand how diminishing that sounds. I understand why you put the ring in the drawer. He knew about the ring. I had told him in the kitchen. But hearing him say it, the ring, with full comprehension of what it meant, what I had been carrying and then surrendered, something moved in my chest. Shifted. I did not let it show on my face because one cracked expression from me in this conversation would become about comfort rather than truth, and we needed truth right now more than we needed comfort. I needed you to choose me, I said. Without hesitation. Without hedging. I needed to be someone you reached for, not someone you settled into. I know. Knowing now isn't the same as having done it. I know that too. He looked at me from the floor of our living room, his back against the couch, the city glowing amber behind him, and for the first time in 5 years I could see him without the ease. Without the comfortable confidence of a man who had never had to fight for something because the thing he wanted had always been right there, choosing him daily, quietly, without demanding to be chosen in return. He looked terrified. And real. And more like someone worth staying for than he had looked in weeks. But love is not a feeling you act on immediately just because it visits you at 2 in the morning in a dark living room. I had learned that much. Get some sleep, I said. I stood, crossed to where he was sitting. And I did something I had not done in 6 weeks. I pressed my hand briefly to the top of his head. Just for a moment. Just enough to be felt. Then I went back to the bedroom. 13 days until Brussels. And Marcus finally, fully, devastatingly awake to something he should have understood years ago, that the person who always stayed had simply been choosing to. Every single day. And choices, unlike landscapes, can change. What he did with that understanding in the days that followed would determine everything. And I had no idea yet whether he was capable of what it would require. Chapter 5. The Airport. I packed methodically. That is the kind of man I am, or the kind I had learned to become, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between watching my father perform composure and deciding I would find a way to actually inhabit it. I folded things precisely. Organized by category. Made lists and checked them and did not let myself sit on the edge of the bed and stare at the half-filled suitcase the way some part of me wanted to, the way the softer, less disciplined version of myself kept suggesting. The ring was still in the drawer. I had looked at it once, on the 10th day after our kitchen conversation, opened the nightstand and stood there regarding it the way you regard something that has changed its meaning without changing its appearance. It was the same ring. Same weight, same simple band, same small precision of the stone I had chosen because Marcus always said he hated things that announced themselves too loudly. It was exactly what I had imagined on his hand. I closed the drawer. Marcus had been different in those final days. Not performing different. I want to make that distinction carefully because I had become very good at reading the difference between Marcus managing his presentation and Marcus actually shifting underneath. This was the latter. Something had genuinely reorganized itself inside him after the living room floor conversation. Something structural rather than cosmetic, and I could see it in the way he moved through our apartment in those last 13 days. He stopped hovering. That might sound small. It was not small. In the weeks before, his anxiety had made him proximate, always in the room I was in, always slightly angled toward me, a compass needle trembling toward north. It had the suffocating quality of attention that comes from fear rather than desire. But in those final days he gave me space. Real space. The kind that communicates trust rather than indifference. He went to his own appointments. Saw his own friends. Came home and told me about his day without searching my face for signs. He had also, he mentioned quietly one evening, made an appointment with a therapist. He said it simply. Without presentation. Without waiting for my reaction in the way people do when they're using a good decision as currency. He said it the way you report a fact. I have a dentist appointment Thursday, I start therapy next Tuesday, and then he asked me what I wanted for dinner. I had looked at him across the kitchen and felt something ache in a way that was not entirely painful. He was learning, finally, how to do something without it being for me. The morning of my flight arrived the way mornings do, indifferently, fully lit, requiring things of me before I was ready to be required of. My flight was at 2 in the afternoon. I had booked a car for 11. The suitcase was by the door. The apartment had the particular quality of spaces that know they are about to be reconfigured. A held breath stillness, objects too aware of their own positions. Marcus was already awake when I came out of the bedroom. He was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee he had made for both of us, 2 cups, and he was not on his phone. He was just sitting. Waiting without making a production of waiting, which was new. I sat across from him. We drank coffee. The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. It did not have the strangled quality of silences in which both people are suppressing something enormous. It was simply 2 people sitting together in the knowledge that in a few hours one of them would be somewhere else, and neither of them had resolved yet what that meant. I'm not going to make a speech, Marcus said finally. I looked at him over my cup. I practiced one. A brief, self-aware almost smile. Several, actually. Different versions. Some of them were, honestly they were quite good. Rhetorically. He wrapped both hands around his mug. But I think speeches are what I do when I'm more interested in how I sound than what's actually true. And I'm trying to stop doing things like that. Okay, I said. I just want to say one thing. I waited. I'm not asking you to stay. He met my eyes and held them with a directness that was different from his usual confidence. Steadier, less performed. I understand why you're going. I think you should go, actually. I think you've been the person who stayed and adjusted and waited long enough, and you deserve to do something that's entirely yours for a while. The car was coming in 90 minutes. But I need you to know. He stopped. I watched him locate the words from somewhere that cost him something. You changed me. Not in the way people say that when they mean you made me feel good about myself. I mean you actually changed the architecture of how I move through the world. And I didn't protect that. I didn't protect you. And I will spend however long it takes making sure you know that I understand the difference now. I set my cup down. There was something happening in my chest. That specific pressure that gathers when you are actively preventing yourself from feeling the full weight of something because you are not yet in a place where you can afford to feel it. I recognized it. I pressed it down. Marcus, I'm not finished. Not sharp. Just certain. A new kind of certain, the kind that doesn't need volume. I want to marry you. I want that. Not because I'm afraid of what happens if you leave. Not because I'm panicking. He exhaled slowly. Because you are the only person I have ever known who made ordinary life feel like something worth building. And I was so busy being terrified of not deserving that I forgot to just want it. Out loud. Where you could hear it. The city outside the windows was doing what it always did. Indifferent. Continuous. Real. I know this isn't the moment, he said. I know one conversation doesn't rebuild what I let erode. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. He pushed his coffee cup slightly to the side. A small, precise gesture making space. I'm just asking you not to leave thinking I don't love you. Because I do. I love you in a way that I clearly failed to demonstrate, but it was never absent. It was just cowardly. I looked at him for a long time. The man across from me was not the man I had stood behind in a hallway 6 weeks ago. Not because he had become someone different, but because something that had always been inside him, something real and solid that his fear had been sitting on top of for 5 years, was finally visibly on the surface. It would have been so easy to stay. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that everything in me that had spent 5 years reaching across distances wanted to close this one immediately. Wanted to say don't worry, it's fine, I'm not going anywhere. Wanted to fold back into the warmth of him the way you fold back into sleep on a cold morning because sleep is right there and warmth is right there and the world outside can wait. But I had learned something in 6 weeks of grief that I had not known in 5 years of loving him. That I was worth being chosen correctly. Not just chosen. Correctly. With intention. With full knowledge of what was being chosen and why. And one morning of honest conversation, even a beautiful one, even one that cracked something open in me that I could feel, was not the same as the slow, consistent, chosen thing that love required. Marcus had taught me that accidentally by making me feel its absence. The car arrived at 11. I stood in the doorway of our apartment with my suitcase and I looked at him. Really looked at him the way I had stopped letting myself look for 6 weeks, and I let him see me do it. Let him see that it cost me something to turn around. I'll call you when I land, I said. He nodded. His jaw was tight. He was holding himself very still the way people do when they're afraid that movement will cause them to lose their grip on something. Okay, he said. I took the elevator down. I did not cry in the car. I watched New York move past the windows. All that beautiful, indifferent momentum, all those lives happening sideways to mine, and I held the weight of what I was carrying the way I had learned to hold things. Steadily. Without dropping it. Without letting it crush me. I boarded the plane. I found my seat. And somewhere over the Atlantic, in the specific suspension of being between two places and belonging fully to neither, I reached into my jacket pocket out of pure muscle memory, and found it empty. The ring was in the drawer 3,000 miles behind me. And I did not yet know whether that was the end of something or simply the longest possible beginning. But Marcus had said one thing in that kitchen that I could not stop hearing at 30,000 feet above the ocean. He had said, however long it takes. And for the first time since the hallway, I wanted to find out if he meant it. Chapter 6. Chasing Across Continents. Brussels in November is the color of an old photograph. Not unbeautiful, just muted like the city is perpetually remembering something rather than experiencing it. Gray mornings that arrive slowly, stone buildings holding the cold the way old buildings do, the particular smell of rain on cobblestones that I had not known I would find comforting until I was standing in it, 3,000 miles from everything familiar, on my first morning in a city that did not yet know my name. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building near the Ixelles commune. Small, high-ceilinged, with windows that let in more light than their size suggested and a radiator that, I noticed on the first night with something that split me open briefly, clanked. I stood in my new kitchen listening to it and felt the particular absurdity of the universe making its small jokes. Then I unpacked. Methodically. The way I do things. The ring I had retrieved from the nightstand at the last possible moment. I do not know exactly when I made that decision, only that I found it in my jacket pocket somewhere over the Atlantic and understood that I had put it there without fully acknowledging that I was doing so. I placed it on the shelf above the kitchen window when I arrived. Not in a drawer. Just visible. Present. A question I had not yet answered, living in plain sight. I told myself I was simply not ready to put it away permanently. I did not examine that too closely. Marcus called the evening I landed. Not a text. A call, which was itself a small declaration because Marcus was a habitual texter, someone who used written words to manage the distance between his interior and his exterior, to edit and revise before delivering. A call meant no editing. It meant real-time, unrevised Marcus. "You landed," he said when I picked up. "I landed." "How's the apartment?" "Small. The radiator has opinions." A breath that was almost a laugh. "Of course it does." We talked for 40 minutes about nothing significant. The flight, the neighborhood, the strange particular exhaustion of arriving somewhere new where you must immediately begin the work of orienting yourself. He asked careful questions and listened to the answers with the quality of attention I had always valued in him, that ability to make you feel like what you were saying was the only thing happening in his world. When we hung up, I sat in my new kitchen for a long time. I looked at the ring on the shelf. I did not know yet what I was doing. I only knew that I had answered the phone. He called again the next evening. And the one after that. Not always long calls. Sometimes just 20 minutes, sometimes interrupted by his schedule or mine, sometimes slightly awkward in the way that new rhythms are awkward before they find their pace. But consistent. Present. There without being asked to be there, which is the only version of presence that means anything. After 2 weeks, he told me about his second therapy session. Not performatively. Not the way he had mentioned the first appointment, with that careful casualness of someone setting down something valuable and watching to see if you notice. This time he just talked about it. What came up? What was difficult? The specific thing his therapist had said that had bothered him all week because it was accurate in a way he hadn't wanted it to be. He was learning, his therapist had apparently observed, to tolerate being known. She said I'd spent a long time making sure no one got close enough to be disappointed by me, Marcus told me. It was a Thursday, 11 his time, 5 in the morning mine. I had woken early and not bothered trying to return to sleep, just made tea and sat by the window watching Brussels go from dark to gray. And I said that wasn't true. And then she just waited. And I sat there for a really long time and then I said, okay, maybe? Only maybe? I'm paying her by the hour. I'm not giving her everything at once. This time I did laugh. A real one, unguarded, the kind that arrives before you can decide whether to allow it. There was a pause on his end of the line. I haven't heard that in a while, he said quietly. No, I agreed. I missed it. I looked at the ring on the shelf. The early light was reaching it now, that thin November dawn, and it caught it in a way that was almost unreasonably cinematic. Marcus, I said. I know, he said. I'm not trying to rush anything. I just wanted you to know. And that was the thing. He wasn't rushing. I had been waiting, with a vigilance I recognized as self-protective, for the desperation to surface, for the flood of messages, the grand gestures, the emotional pressure that would have told me this was still about his fear rather than my worth. It never came. What came instead was consistency. Quiet, undramatic, daily consistency. The kind that does not photograph well or make for compelling storytelling but is, in practice, the only thing that rebuilds what erosion has taken. He visited for the first time in December. 4 days. He stayed in a hotel 2 streets from my apartment because I had not invited him to stay with me and he had not assumed. He arrived with good coffee from the place near our nearest apartment, and a book he had finished that he thought I would like, and no agenda beyond being in the same city as me for 4 days. We walked. We ate. We sat in a small bar on the second evening and talked for 3 hours about things we had never quite gotten to in 5 years of shared domesticity, the kind of conversations that require a certain quality of attention that ordinary life tends to crowd out. He told me things about his childhood I had known the outline of but never the texture. I told him things about my father that I had summarized before but never fully said. On the last evening he walked me back to my building and stopped at the door and did not come up. This was good, he said. It was, I agreed. He looked at me in the amber light of the street lamp, the city quiet around us, cold breath visible between us, and there was something in his face that I had not seen there before. Not the ease of a man who trusts his footing. Something harder one than ease. Something that had been built rather than assumed. He kissed me once, briefly, at the corner of my mouth. Then he went back to his hotel. I stood on the street for a moment after he turned the corner. Then I went upstairs and stood in my kitchen and looked at the ring on the shelf for a very long time. The months moved the way months do when you are living inside them rather than waiting for them to end, with texture and incident, with bad days and unremarkable ones and occasional days of such ordinary grace that you notice them and file them somewhere careful. Marcus visited 3 more times. I returned to New York once in February, officially for a work meeting, and we had dinner and walked the streets of a city I had half expected to feel foreign to me but which received me with the total indifference of a place that simply continues existing regardless of your relationship to it. We were building something. Neither of us named it yet. But I could feel its shape, the architecture of it, the careful weight-bearing structure being assembled slowly between two people who had learned, through rupture, what they were actually making. He called me one evening in late March with something different in his voice. A quality I could not immediately identify, not nervousness exactly. More like the composure of someone who has decided something and is carrying the decision carefully, the way you carry something full. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay. Will you tell me if the answer is no? Actually tell me, not just go quiet." Something gathered in my chest. "Yes," I said. "I'll tell you. I'm coming to Brussels next weekend." "I know. You told me. I want to take you somewhere. Saturday evening. There's a square," I looked it up. "Near the Grand Place but quieter. Less crowded." Pause. "I'd like to take you there." I was standing in my kitchen. The ring was on the shelf above the window where it had lived for 4 months. Catching light or not catching it depending on the hour, present regardless, a question I had been living alongside without forcing an answer. "Marcus," I said. "I know what I want to say," he interrupted gently. "I've known for a while. I'm not asking yet, I'm asking if I can ask. If we're in a place where that's something you'd want." The radiator clanked. Brussels went gray and quiet outside my window, and I thought about a hallway. A coat still on my shoulders. A word that had broken something open in me and then, through the long work of months, had somehow become the crack that let everything true finally enter. "Come to Brussels," I said. The square was exactly as he had described it. Small. Cobblestoned. Far enough from the Grand Place that the tourist noise was a distant murmur rather than a presence. Winter street lamps doing their amber work against the early dark. A fountain that was not running in the cold, a bench, a tree that had lost everything but its shape. We had eaten dinner at a place nearby, unhurried, 2 hours, the kind of meal that is really a conversation that happens to involve food. He had been present in the way he had been learning to be present. Without performance, without management, just fully in the room, fully with me. We walked to the square afterward and stood in it for a moment, just taking it in. Then Marcus turned to face me. And he went down on one knee on the cobblestones, not dramatically, not with the stagecraft of a man performing a proposal, but with the deliberate, earnest physicality of someone doing the most honest thing they know how to do. He didn't have a ring. I want you to notice that. He didn't bring one. Because the ring was mine, had always been mine, had been sitting on a shelf in my kitchen for 4 months, and he understood that. He understood that what he was offering was not an object but an intention, and that I could decide what to do with the one that already existed. He looked up at me from the cobblestones of a quiet square in Brussels in the cold winter dark and he said, "I don't want you because you're steady. I don't want you because you're reliable or because being with you is easy or because you make my life feel manageable." His voice was even. Certain in the way that things are certain when they have been tested rather than assumed. "I want you because you are the only place I have ever been fully known and stayed. Because you saw all the ways I was going to fail you and you loved me anyway, and I wasted that for too long by being afraid of it." He breathed. "I'm not afraid of it anymore." The city went about its business around us, indifferent and continuous, all those lives happening in every direction. "You are not safe to me," he said. "You are necessary, and I know the difference now." I reached into my coat pocket. The ring was there. I had put it there that morning without allowing myself to make a ceremony of the decision, the same way I had put it in my pocket on the plane without acknowledging what I was doing. Some decisions, I have learned, are made quietly in the body before the mind gets around to ratifying them. I held it out to him. He looked at it in my open hand. Looked up at me. "Yes," I said. Before he could ask again. Before anything else could happen in the long space between us that had once felt like distance and now felt simply like room. Room to breathe, room to choose, room to be two people who had broken something and then done the patient, unglamorous, necessary work of building it back stronger. "Yes," I said again, because it was worth saying twice. He took the ring from my hand and put it on his finger and stood up from the cobblestones, and when he kissed me it was in the particular way of someone who is not afraid of what comes next. Not because the future is certain, because it never is, but because he finally, fully, understood what he was choosing. And I held on to him in a quiet square in Brussels, winter air cold against my face and his arms warm around me, and I felt, not relief exactly. Not the ending of tension the way I had imagined it, back in a hallway with a coat on my shoulders and a ring in my pocket and a future dissolving in real time. What I felt was simpler than relief. I felt chosen. Not because I had always been there, but because he had crossed an ocean to find me after I left. And that, I had learned, was the difference between being loved and being seen.